There's a 0% chance that this actually works. I'm just gonna get close. Alright, this isn't gonna work. All right, we are back. This is episode 1 billion million jillion fillion, which means we are back in 2 Timothy chapter 2. And we are continuing this discussion of faithfulness. And what we saw yesterday is that faithfulness is what God uses to measure your life. And it's kind of like this. Let's pretend that here is a football field and there's this football game going on or whatever. And the football guy catches the football. He's a running back, and here he catches it. That's a football. And he's running with the football or potato, whatever you think that is. And the announcer goes, he's at the 40. And then he keeps going and says, he's at the 30, he's at the 20, he's at the 10, and then touchdown, and there's fireworks, and everyone's cheering, and they won the Super Bowl, and all this great stuff happens, and whatever, football. In the same way that when a football player has the ball and he's moving forward, his run is measured by what? By yards. And you don't measure a football run with, kilometers because this is America and we don't like kilometers. And you also don't measure it with pounds or kilograms because that wouldn't even make sense. You measure a football run with yards. And in the same way, a successful life is measured with faithfulness. Faithfulness is the measurement by which God will evaluate your life. And as we continue to think through that question of how exactly are we to be faithful? And what does that faithfulness look like? Paul continues to tell us in verse 3. And so let's get into it. Verse 3, Paul says, suffer hardship with me. We've seen Paul talk about suffering like in chapter 1, verse 8, where he says, and Tommy will put it right here, bing, but join with me in suffering for the gospel according to the power of God. But this verse right here in verse 3 is slightly different because Paul isn't saying just that suffering is tied with being bold, but he's saying that suffering is in part how you accomplish ministry. How do you move forward in serving Christ? You suffer, you embrace it. And suffering isn't something that's just unique to Paul as if, hey, only Paul is going to suffer. No, suffering is common for the believer. This is to be expected, and this is actually good. And look at how the suffering takes place. As a good soldier of Christ Jesus, Paul uses this same kind of soldier and warfare imagery quite a bit. And a good example of that is 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3. He says, for though we walk in the flesh, we don't war according to the flesh. And just a few verses down, he'll say, we are taking every what? Every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And so just as a soldier is disciplined, that's the same kind of discipline that we've been called to where we discipline our mind and our hearts to think and feel biblically, even in the midst of suffering, that we take every single thought captive. And this verse is pretty shocking because I think as Americans, we are used to comfort. And whenever we're not comfortable, we tend to gravitate toward and find a way where we can just be comfortable again. That's not the nature of ministry. Paul is so clear here that, hey, if you are going to follow Christ, this is what you can expect. Expect to suffer hardship. And if that's persecution from the world, if that's betrayal from someone close to you, if that's discouragement within the church or even disappointment in your life, you embrace that and you embrace it as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. Not as a bad soldier who doesn't care about the war that they're fighting, but as a good soldier, you care about this cause. This is a war worth fighting for. This is a cause worthy of your whole life, and you make that a priority. And so, yes, there will be trials, and yes, there will be burdens that we will face constantly, but you ready yourself for that battle, and you accept it, whatever it may be, and you discipline yourself. Your mind, your thoughts, your emotions, you don't let them run wild because that would be a weak soldier.
All right, episode 40. We have 2 questions for you today on Question Time with Tommy. Our first one is, why is it vital to a Christian's walk to be disciplined, and discipline specifically your heart and your mind? And our second question is related. what things can go wrong if we don't choose to practice discipline, if we just don't pay attention to that at all. All right, that is it. We will see you guys back here tomorrow.